Hello, my name is Diana Griffin, and for the Visual Information Design course at UW's Informatics program, I chose Universal Pre-K for my final infographic topic. Here's my final infographic. We're going to go over the three models that I chose to emulate everything in this infographic after. And then we're going to go piece by piece through the maps, the relationship, the numbers, and the time elements. And lastly, I will show you how I put everything together and some of the decisions I made and what I have learned and the big takeaways from this class. The first model was the Curious Planets at the Movies. I chose this model because I thought all of these very vibrant elements contributed a lot, and I thought that would be a really great one to follow for primary or elementary education. It has definitely huge whimsical aspects, and it conveys a very fun nature, which I definitely wanted to do as well with my infographic. Everything is straightforward shapes, either circles, ovals, and straight lines and squares. This definitely proved to be a bit more of a challenge than I expected to make everything follow these criteria, but it did afford me a great learning experience, and I'm glad I chose this model because a lot of the tools that I would have used, I may not have used otherwise. One of my favorite elements here is this swirling spiral of film. I use ribbon instead for mine, but I was able to completely emulate the shifting 3D effects of this, and that's one of the things I'm most proud of. Other things to notice, all of the elements end up in long landscape rectangles, but some of them have multiple sections in them, which I did one or two of. But for the most part, everything is long rectangles. And everything is separated by, all the different elements are separated by this nice thin line. It turns out for this visual language, it's not that apparent. This line is not that apparent. So sometimes they separate multiple things with two different lines, and it's kind of hard to see. So I think mine actually does a much better job, which we will talk about later. The only texture that I was afforded was that the visual language model had was this wall, which I absolutely made use of. Next in the models are my color model. My color model had this beautiful vibrant green color for the mane, which I absolutely loved. I thought it also conveyed the very whimsical nature. But it also, with the three shades, I was able to use that really well to create depth through that. One thing with my visual language model, I was not allowed the outlines that these lovely characters have. So I had to be a little bit more creative in making sure that I had those conveyed that 3D element, especially with the lighter colors. For text, we have white letters on the dark background, so the darkest of the shades, which you normally see in their shirts or skirt. And so white on the dark, or dark on the lightest. Furthermore, this color model also makes use of this nice striped pattern to convey depth and, funnily enough, countries where there is no data, which I made use of as well. My last model is my typography model. It was went really well with both of my other models, and I love this the uh, uh, simple but very stately um, all caps letters. Everything was very easy to read with the sizable space between lines you don't always see in infographics. Lastly, the numbers. I don't use that many numbers in pulled out, but I did use, all of my numbers are in labels, so you'll see lots of these smaller numbers, small thin numbers used in my infographic. So my first element were these blocks. It was the first thing I made, so it took a little bit of practice to get used to all of my models. Here I thought it would be a good idea to do these adorable blocks with the 3D element. I was very proud of this. Unfortunately, I got lots of critiques that I shouldn't have 3D in that way. So I straight away went on the head-on look, and I made these layers myself, but it wasn't quite as clean as I would like, especially on the C. So in my final revision, I made them all a typeface and cleaned up some of the other lines. The first of the more in-depth models was my location model. This was emulated after the posters you saw in the visual language model. My first revision was just the tableau map with the lighter upturn at the end, but the outlines here definitely conflicted with my visual layout model. And it doesn't really, these lighter colors blend into the ocean a bit more than I would like. So in my revision, I separated out the ocean and the continents a bit more, and I have it on a spectrum from the dark pink to the light green. So whereas United States kind of blends into the background in the first edition, it really stands out as being bad in the second, because the United States actually spends second to least of the surveyed countries on early childhood education, especially pre-K. So here we see the final one. While this white drew a little bit too much attention and pulled the eyes and just didn't really convey that those were just countries that didn't have information. I decided to use the striped lines to convey that. There's no texture in my visual language model, but because the color model used it in the exact same way, and because I stayed clear of using outlines, I am confident in my decision that it definitely fell in between the color and the visual language, and so I'm confident in my decision to go with that. We also see here my use of the walls. This helped me to fill out the four corners of the element, which is a goal that I tried to accomplish on each of the ones, as we will see. We also see how I have the source and emulate the typography model here as well. This is the only location where I have a color on anything other, colored text on anything other than white, or a light version of that color. Because it's gray, it didn't conflict very much, and so it keeps the same spirit of having it on white. My next element is the relationship model. These little characters pull almost directly from the shapes used in the visual language model for the posters. So my first rendition was a simple Venn diagram. Unfortunately, this confused some people because it doesn't add up to 100, and it's not supposed to. But there's so much information to convey here. It definitely was a challenge for me to find out exactly how to convey this information. finally, I settled on having all 100 children shown. And so the blue children here we see signify the ones in poverty, and the pink children, or not in poverty, and the pink children are the ones in poverty. This helps really clarify exactly what this circle was. So now we see this circle being these children here. And it also highlights that 6 out of 100 children are in poverty and not ready for kindergarten, and 6 children are who aren't in poverty are not ready for kindergarten, which when you as the right up here shows, children living in poverty are nearly 4 times as likely to be ill-prepared for kindergarten, which is an absolutely huge difference, and definitely makes it pointed to why we need to have pre-K to even these disparities. One of the other changes I made from the previous emulation to this rendition, instead of having this a green square, I have it gray so that it conflicts with the colors inside less and follows the color model more precisely. As well, this had been black text, and I changed it these boxes to the lightest instead of medium, and had this be the darkest text instead of black, which again follows the visual color model like to a T. Now we come to the first numbers. Just a second. So here we have the first numbers. These ones change probably the least. I spent a lot of time on these trains the first time through, so I didn't receive hardly any critiques on the trains themselves. So it went from these tracks. I had the tracks over here to signify the key, to just having these tracks signifying the 100 points. So if all of these bars are out of 100, that's where the tracks end. This is never explicitly stated, but it does. It did have everyone that I surveyed said something of the lines of it does kind of visually make sense, even if they didn't explicitly think that. They are just so used to seeing those bars to 100. In my final rendition of it, I lightened the train tracks because they were detracting a bit of the attention from these numbers, which I really wanted to highlight, as well as when it was seen on the big poster, the black just made it a little bit too busy, and lightening up just that little bit made it much easier on the eyes and made it compete less for attention with all of the other elements, because I don't want any to stand out that much more than the others. I also shortened did not to didn't. Not very big changes, but it looks professional and polished, and it absolutely works well with the other elements. Next, we have vocabulary. Vocabulary has the biggest change. So it started out with these books, and it eventually went into these crayons. There was just not nearly enough room on these books, no matter how big I made them, unless they were going to take up all of the space. There was just no way to get all of the information I wanted there. So I instead decided to make it a line graph. The books definitely went a bit more with the visual language model. There are no lines in my, other than the walls and the separating lines in my visual language, but with the fun texture, semi-texture of these crayons, it made the lines seem a bit more like they were part of all of the various elements on the page. So it the spirit, even if it does not technically fit the visual language model to a T. There were some shortcomings, and for the numbers, only bar charts were very well represented in the visual language model. So I had to take a few creative liberties to make maps and this line graph work. But it keeps the spirit, so I am happy with it and confident in those decisions. That being said, I did need it to be a little bit more professional so I straightened out these crayons as well as made sure that it had been black text on color. So I changed that to it all being the darkest shade on the lightest shade, like we talked about earlier, to fit the color layout. And similar to the train tracks, I made this light or a dark gray instead of a black. This is one of the bolder chunks of black on the entire infographic, so that pulled quite a bit too much attention. So this made it much easier on the eyes. And on to the last element we'll be talking about in detail today. This was my time element. It is a ribbon. So this is the ribbon element that we saw in the close-up of the visual language model, where they had the film roll. This was one of the first times I felt very confident playing with Illustrator, making these swooshes in different colors and really joining things and getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly how all of these tools work. It needed a little bit more intrigue. It didn't really show that it was ribbon, and even if it was ribbon, it didn't seem very preschooly. So I added a pair of scissors and a spool, made sure that they were very kid-friendly scissors, and put a little bit more detail. I even made the little circles into buttons with little round points, but you can't see them because they are absolutely tiny. So I revised that a lot to keep the spirit, and you can actually see that there are buttons on this last part. But it took a bit of work and consolidating some of these lines to make them really fit into the page, especially where I wanted them to be, and also look like buttons and not completely overpower the ribbon. So that was one of the more challenging balances that I had to make for this. And that leads us to the final infographic. Some of the things I wanted to tell at first I wanted to tell a story with all the pieces as I put them together that led this map and this timeline to be way too close together since they are the two darkest pieces. And I also had, I kept the shape of the layout model where it has the most narrow portion being in line with, which I had with this, being in line with this so that the lines match up a little better. But with my specific elements, that left these trains and these people in the relationship model much too close together, and it also left the map and this ribbon way closer together. So I decided instead to value making sure that these two busy elements are nearly as far away from each other as possible, and these two bold elements are at least kitty corner. That makes the balance look much better. Everything still fits together, and just because these lines aren't perfectly across from each other, I still think it looks very elegant, and I am very pleased with this solution. One last thing I did want to draw attention to, something that I was very excited about. In my education classes, since I am an education minor, we recently learned that 700 new neural connections are made every second in a baby brain. However, shortly before I had to put together this final infographic, it was Harvard released a new study that expanded it from 700 new neural connections every second to 1 million. This was literally in April of this year, 2017. So I had to make sure to make a little bit of room. Luckily, I needed something to fill in the space because this is the squarest element that I had. So I got to add a little baby brain and that very fun, very timely piece of information. Um, I learned so much this quarter from much more detailed uh, look into typography and color design, as well as just getting very confident with the tools of Illustrator and Photoshop and a few other Adobe products. I learned to think on my feet, and I really built some skills that I could absolutely not have done before this class. So that was a wonderful learning experience. So thank you.